Hey guys, tonight we're rolling into something a lot less glamorous than the war movies made it out to be. We're talking about the reality of sitting inside a Sherman tank in Italy during World War II. You've probably seen them in films, roaring across open fields, commanders heroically pointing into the distance, crews working like a well-oiled machine. That's the fantasy. The truth is, if you found yourself inside one of those steel beasts in the Italian campaign, you were basically signing up for a front row seat to your own funeral, and not the kind with flowers and a nice speech. More like an abrupt, smoky ending in a place no one can even pronounce. Before we dig in, the usual. Like the video and subscribe if you actually enjoy this kind of thing, but only if you mean it. I'm not holding you hostage. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because I still find it bizarre when someone says they're falling asleep to this in the middle of the afternoon while eating a sandwich. Now if you can, dim the lights, maybe put on some background fan noise and settle in. We're going to be here a while. Congratulations, you've just woken up inside a Sherman tank somewhere in the hills of Italy, 1944. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So is the guy in the German Panther up the road who's been told to make sure that doesn't last much longer. The inside of your new home is hot enough to make you sweat through your uniform before you've even started the engine. And it smells like the world's worst locker room got mixed with an auto repair shop. You're crammed in with 4 other people who you will see, smell, and hear more than your own family for as long as you survive. And survival is the part no one talks about in recruitment posters. The hatch above your head? That's your only way out if things go wrong. And by wrong, I mean the moment the enemy gets a clear shot. And yes, it's a tiny opening you'll somehow need to scramble through while the tank is on fire. The inside filling with smoke, and the rest of the crew is panicking in every direction. But you'll think about that later. For now, you've got to focus on staying alive long enough for later to happen at all. You wake up to the sound of metal groaning. Not in a creepy haunted house kind of way, but in this giant hunk of steel you're living in was welded together in a hurry and has been rattling ever since kind of way. Your bed? Forget that word. You're curled up in what's basically a padded metal bench barely wider than your shoulders, wedged between ammunition racks and the legs of whoever drew the short straw to sit above you. Your back is twisted like a corkscrew, because every surface in here is hard, and the one cushion you have smells like every man who's sweated through it since Tunisia. There's no morning sunlight streaming in, no birdsong, no gentle nudge awake. Just the faint tang of diesel, warm oil, and human body odour trapped in a sealed can. The first thing you notice is that there's no such thing as personal space. Every movement you make is felt by at least one other human. Need to stretch? Good luck. You'll just end up elbowing the loader in the ribs and getting a muttered curse for your trouble. Want to scratch your head? Hope you enjoy knocking your knuckles against a steel wall. Privacy is a fantasy. You can't roll over without someone else having to shift to make room, which means everyone sleeps in the most awkward, cramped positions imaginable, just to avoid bruised ribs and knees in the middle of the night. The temperature inside isn't just uncomfortable, it's actively hostile. Even before you start the engine, the Italian summer sun has turned this tank into a slow cooker. The metal hull soaks up heat like it's auditioning for a job as an oven, and that heat radiates inward, cooking you from the outside in. Your uniform is already sticking to you, and you haven't moved an inch. In winter, it's the opposite. The same metal hull that bakes you in summer turns into an icebox the moment the temperature drops, and every breath comes out in a puff of steam that just hangs there in the stale air. Your ears are already ringing, and the day hasn't even begun. That's because every little sound in here, someone shifting, a boot scraping, a wrench tapping against the side, echoes around like a drum. Once the engine starts, it won't just be loud. It'll be the kind of loud that vibrates in your bones, a constant mechanical roar you can't talk over, only shout. After a few weeks, you'll get used to it, which is another way of saying you'll go slightly deaf and stop noticing the ringing in your ears. You'd think there would be a way to make this space more livable. A cushion here, a curtain there. Maybe a little storage for personal things. Forget it. The Sherman wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be cheap, easy to build, and able to roll forward while throwing shells in the general direction of the enemy. Every square inch inside is crammed with something deemed essential, which somehow includes a dozen awkwardly placed bolts ready to stab your knee at the slightest movement, but doesn't include anywhere to put your spare socks. Your gear is either on you or shoved into whatever crevice you can find, and if you lose it, it's gone. The smell is indescribable, but I'll try anyway. Take engine oil, hot metal, unwashed uniforms, and a week-old sandwich that's been sitting in a closed lunchbox. Then mix it with a faint whiff of exhaust fumes and a background hint of wet canvas. That's the scent of your new home. You'll get used to it in the same way people get used to living next to a sewage plant. You stop noticing, but it never actually gets better. The walls are close, very close. You can't stand up fully unless you're in the commander's position with your head sticking out the hatch. And even then you have to hunch. The floor is covered with metal panels hiding cables and mechanical parts you don't want to step on. And every surface it's just waiting to bang your elbows, knees or head. You will hit your head on something at least once a day, probably more. There's no graceful way to move inside a Sherman. You shuffle, crouch, twist, and sometimes half climb over another human to get to where you need to be. And that's the peaceful part. Right now, you're not moving, you're not firing, and you're not under attack. Or you're just sitting in a cramped steel box, sweating, listening to the muffled voices of your crew, and hoping the day doesn't involve flames. You haven't even gotten to the part where the tank starts moving, lurching forward with every bump and rock, throwing you into walls, into each other, into anything that isn't bolted down, and some things that are. You think about the name they give these things in training, mobile firepower, and it sounds impressive. What they don't mention is that you're basically rolling around in a metal coffin that doubles as a target. The Germans have guns that can punch through your armour from over a mile away, and you know it. You also know that once they spot you, your survival depends on whether your driver can get you into cover faster than the enemy can reload. Inside, you'll hear the clang of shells hitting the hull, the gut punch thud when something pierces it, and if you're really unlucky, the sudden whoosh of air as fire spreads through the compartment. The Italians have terrain that hates you. Steep hills, narrow roads, stone villages built before tanks were a thing. All of it designed unintentionally to make moving this big box of metal as difficult as possible. You're not rolling across smooth fields like in the movies. You're grinding up rocky paths, skirting along cliff edges, and trying not to get bogged down in mud that smells suspiciously like something died in it last week. Your driver swears under his breath every time you scrape the side against a wall or stall on a slope. And the whole time, you're bouncing around inside like laundry in a dryer, except your dryer is full of ammunition and people yelling at each other over the noise. You can't really relax. Even when nothing is happening, you know something could happen in the next second. An ambush from a tree line, an artillery round dropping nearby, a mine buried under the road. The enemy doesn't have to destroy you completely. All they have to do is immobilize you, and you become a stationary target for every weapon in range. That thought sits in the back of your mind all the time, a low-level anxiety that never really fades. So here you are, cramped, sweaty, deafened, and one good hit away from being roasted alive. The Sherman tank is called a lot of things: dependable, mass-produced, even the tank that won the war. But when you're inside one, crawling through the Italian countryside, it just feels like what it is: a steel coffin on tracks, and you're expected to call it home. It hits you the moment you climb inside. That smell. It's not one thing. It's everything, all at once, in layers so thick you could probably slice them like cake if you had the right knife. You've got the base note of oil, the kind that seeps into your clothes and skin no matter how careful you are. On top of that, there's the hot, sharp tang of exhaust fumes, because even when the engine's off, the residue lingers in every corner. Then comes the human part: sweat that's soaked into the padding, the canvas straps, even the floor panels. You'd think human sweat would fade after a while, but no. In here, it ferments, locked in by steel walls that make sure it never really escapes. That's just a normal background scent. Every once in a while something else will join the party. Burnt cordite from the last time you fired the main gun, maybe. A hint of mildew from whatever moisture seeped in during last week's rainstorm and is now slowly rotting in some unreachable crevice. And sometimes, just to keep things interesting, the ghost of whatever canned meat the loader spilled down behind the ammo racks and couldn't be bothered to clean up because the tank was moving, and getting your arms stuck back there seemed like a worse fate than letting the smell become a permanent resident. You can't escape it. You can't open a window. The hatches are the only real ventilation, and opening those in combat is basically inviting death to climb in. Even when you do crack them during downtime, all it does is swap the tank smell for the smell of whatever Italian farmyard you're parked next to. Manure, stagnant water, maybe something dead in a ditch. And then that blends into the tank smell until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The worst part: you stop noticing after a while. Your brain just gives up and decides this is the new normal. Then you step outside for a minute, breathe actual air, and when you come back in, it's like getting punched in the face by every bad decision you've ever made. You wonder if it's killing brain cells. But honestly, you're more concerned about the fact that your uniform now permanently smells like a garage that also functions as a locker room and occasionally a latrine. The floor doesn't help. It's not clean. It's never clean. Mud gets tracked in on boots. Oil drips from somewhere no one can find, and little bits of food get ground into the grit. You can sweep it, but all you're doing is rearranging the filth into smaller piles. The smell coming off it is faint but persistent, like the low hum of a machine you can't turn off. And if something spills in here, water, coffee, fuel, it doesn't really dry. It just soaks into the floor padding or metal seams and becomes another layer in the olfactory nightmare. The air is heavy. You'd think a big hunk of steel would have plenty of open space for air to circulate, but no. The crew breathes the same stale oxygen over and over until it's warm and damp. You can almost feel it on your skin. A thin film of other people's breath clinging to you. Add in the smoke from cigarettes, because almost everyone smokes. And now you've got a haze that just sits there until the engine starts and the fans kick in. And even then, the fans are about as effective as blowing on a house fire with a drinking straw. It's not just a bad smell. It's a smell that follows you. You take it with you when you climb out, when you go to the mess tent, when you try to sleep in a billet somewhere else for a night. The other guys notice. You notice them noticing. You can't do anything about it. Washing your uniform helps for maybe an hour until you're back in the tank and it soaks it all up again. Your skin starts to smell like the tank. Your hair smells like the tank. Even the inside of your helmet smells like the tank. Because of course it does. It lives in here too. And let's not forget about the fuel. You're surrounded by it. You can smell it even when the caps are sealed. It seeps into the background until suddenly you're reminded of it in the worst possible way. Like when a line gets bled, or you top off the tank and some drips inside. Then it's overwhelming, sharp and chemical. The kind of smell that makes your eyes water and your throat itch. You can taste it in the back of your mouth. And you know it's not doing you any favours health-wise, but you've got bigger problems than future lung issues. The loader's position is right next to the ammo racks, and those shells have their own distinct, metallic, chemical smell. It's not strong, but when you're nose to nose with them all day, you start to notice. They smell like danger, literally. The propellant inside them has a sharp, acrid scent that's just faint enough to make you wonder if you're imagining it, until the next time the breech opens and the smell punches you full force. That one sticks in your nose for hours. Now mix all of that. Oil, sweat, exhaust, mildew, cigarette smoke, fuel, cordite, wet canvas, bad food, and the faint tang of explosives. And compress it into a space smaller than a bedroom with 5 grown men. That's your new home. You live here, you eat here, you fight here. And when you're not in here, you're thinking about the next time you'll have to be in here. Because like it or not, this stinking metal box is the only thing between you and a German 88mm shell. You start to realise the smell is more than just unpleasant. It's a constant reminder of where you are and what you're doing. You can't pretend this is anything but a war machine when every breath is full of its insides. You can't forget you're one bad day away from never smelling anything again, because here, smell and survival are connected. The second you smell something burning that isn't supposed to be burning, you're in trouble. The second you smell more fuel than usual, trouble. A whiff of smoke where there shouldn't be any. You don't stop to think, you just react, because seconds matter when you're in a rolling bomb. Some of the guys give the tank nicknames. You hear them tossed around in the field, things like Old Smoky or Stinker. But you know it's not really affection. It's a coping mechanism. Naming the thing makes it feel a little less like an anonymous death trap, and a little more like something you can joke about. But when you're sitting here in the half dark, listening to the faint ticking of cooling metal. It's hard to feel warm toward a place that smells like it's trying to suffocate you. You think back to the recruiting posters. They didn't mention this. They didn't talk about how your sense of smell would be permanently altered, or how you'd start dreaming about fresh air the way some people dream about home. They didn't mention that after the war, you'll probably catch a whiff of engine oil in a parking lot somewhere, and feel your stomach tighten before you even know why. This smell is going to stick with you for years, whether you want it to or not. And here's the thing, you can't clean it out. Oh sure, you can scrub, you can air it out when you've got downtime, you can wipe down every surface with rags until your hands are raw. It doesn't matter. The smell lives in the paint now. It's in the padding, it's in the floor panels, it's in the wiring, it's in you. You are part of the smell now, and it's part of you. So you settle in, you shift in your seat, adjust your helmet, and take another breath. Because you have to. The engine will start soon, and the smell will change again. Richer, hotter, more alive. And as much as you hate it, you know you'll miss it for half a second if it ever stops completely. Because if you're still breathing tank air, it means you're still here. You already knew tanks weren't spacious. You've seen photos, maybe a diagram in a manual, and thought, okay, it's tight, but it can't be that bad. Then you actually climb in with the full crew, and the first thing you realise is that the designers must have been sadists. Either that, or they were all 5 foot nothing and thought everyone else was too. There's no such thing as a standing room inside a Sherman. At best you've got hunch room, enough space to sort of straighten your back if you tilt your head at a weird angle and wedge 1 foot under something. The rest of the time, you're hunched, crouched, or twisted like you're playing an endless game of contortionist limbo. Every position hurts after about 2 minutes, but it's not like you can change into something more comfortable. You've got a job to do, and the job doesn't care if your spine feels like it's folding in half. The crew positions are fixed. If you're the driver, you're basically sitting in a steel recliner with the reclining part removed, legs jammed forward to reach the pedals. You can't fully stretch them without hitting the hull, and you're wedged in so tightly that if you drop something, it's gone. The co-driver is in the same boat, or same box really, with the added bonus of a machine gun that takes up half his leg space. The gunner sits in the turret, knees pulled up awkwardly, constantly twisting to adjust the main gun and side optics. The loader has the worst seat of all, half sitting, half standing, always reaching over or around the gunner to grab shells that weigh as much as a small child. And the commander, well, the commander gets to stand with his head poking out the hatch, which sounds great until it starts raining or the enemy starts shooting at it. Now imagine all 5 of you in here at once. You can't move without touching someone. You can't pass behind someone without making them shift forward, and that means they're knocking into someone else. It's a chain reaction of elbows, knees, and curses. If you're trying to work on your station and the guy next to you needs to move, congratulations. Now you're both in each other's way, and you've somehow managed to hit your head on the turret ring. Again, personal space. That's a joke. You're closer to these men than you've ever been to anyone in your life, and not in a good way. You know how they smell, how they breathe, the exact pitch of their sneeze. You know what it sounds like when they shift in their seat, scratch their leg, or clear their throat. You know what they had for dinner because you're still smelling it 8 hours later. There's also no way to hide your bodily functions. You've got to cough, everyone hears it. Need to shift your weight because your leg's gone numb. Someone else feels it. Got an itch in the middle of your back? Either you ignore it, or you contort yourself like a circus act to scratch it without smacking the guy next to you in the jaw. And when nature calls, well, that's its own brand of awkward. You're not leaving the tank in combat, so you've got a can or a bottle if you're lucky, and the understanding that no one talks about it afterward. Your helmet doesn't help. It bumps into the sides when you turn your head too fast. It catches on exposed bolts, and it makes leaning against anything even more uncomfortable. But you keep it on because if something happens, a sudden stop, a shell impact, a piece of shrapnel flying in through a hatch, you'll be glad for whatever thin protection it gives. Until then, it's just another thing taking up precious inches in a space that already feels like a metal closet with too many people in it. Every surface in here is a hazard. The turret ring has just enough clearance for your arm until someone turns it and you get pinched. The ammo racks have sharp edges. The floor has raised plates you can stub your toes on, even through your boots. There's nowhere soft to land if you fall or get tossed around when the tank lurches, and you will get tossed around. One sudden stop, one sharp turn, and you're bouncing off your crewmates like billiard balls in a too small table. When the tank is moving, the space somehow feels even smaller. You've got to brace yourself against the constant jolts, and that usually means pressing up against another person or wedging yourself between two hard surfaces. You can't see much except the back of the guy in front of you or whatever's directly in your narrow viewing slit. If the commander calls for a turn, you're all swaying together like unwilling dancers in a steel cage. The turret is its own special kind of claustrophobic. It's small, it's round, and it's full of things you can hit your head on. If you're the gunner, you've got one eye glued to the sight and the other trying to keep track of what's going on around you, while the loader is practically climbing over you to get the next shell in. You can't just stand up and stretch. You've got to time your movements between the recoil of the main gun and the constant turning of the turret. Long hours make it worse. You start to feel the walls closing in after a while, like the tank is shrinking around you. Your knees ache, your back is stiff, and your shoulders are locked into a permanent hunch. You've been sitting so long that when you finally do get out, you feel like you're unfolding in slow motion. Your muscles protest, your joints pop, and you realise you've been breathing shallowly for hours because deep breaths mean your ribs expand and bump into something solid. You also can't avoid each other's moods. If one guy's in a bad mood, you're all in a bad mood because there's no way to escape it. You can't take a walk, you can't step outside for air, and you can't pretend you didn't hear him grumbling under his breath. Arguments flare up over stupid things. Who's in whose way? Who misplaced the wrench? Who didn't secure the coffee tin? You learn to let it roll off, because grudges in a space this small are unbearable. Then there's the gear. You've got your personal kit, plus the tank's tools, ammo, spare parts, and whatever other junk the crew's collected. All of it takes up room, and none of it is neatly organised. Stuff shifts around when you're moving, so you're constantly finding a spare helmet wedged behind your seat, or a wrench that somehow slid under the floor panel. You can't really tidy up. You just shove things into the least inconvenient corner, and hope they stay there. You tell yourself you'll get used to it, and in a way, you do. After a while, you stop noticing how close you all are because it becomes the baseline. You stop apologising when you bump into each other. You stop flinching when someone's knee rests against yours for an hour, because there's literally nowhere else to put it. But deep down, you still crave space. Just the ability to take 3 steps in any direction without touching a wall or another human being. When you finally get out after a long day, the world feels huge. You stretch your arms and it feels unnatural, like you're taking up more space than you should. You look up and there's sky instead of a metal ceiling 2 feet above your head. You can walk without bumping into anyone. But you also know it's temporary. The next time the order comes, you'll climb back into the steel box, wedge yourself into your seat, and resume the slow process of learning exactly how much human misery you can pack into one tiny space. And the cruel part? For all its cramped misery, the Sherman's actually more spacious than some tanks. At least that's what you're told. You don't find it comforting. You just wonder what kind of nightmare it must be inside the smaller ones, and hope you never have to find out. It doesn't take long for you to realise that a Sherman tank in summer isn't a vehicle, it's an oven, and you're not the chef, you're the roast. The second the sun comes up, the steel hull starts soaking up heat like it's in competition with the desert. Every surface is hot to the touch. Lean your arm against the side for too long, and it'll feel like you've just brushed up against a frying pan. The paint outside is hot enough to burn your hand, and the inside isn't far behind. It starts as a gradual warmth, something you think you can handle. You tell yourself you'll get used to it, the way you do with uncomfortable boots or a stiff back. But tanks don't have mercy. The heat builds hour after hour, magnified by the fact that you're sealed in a box with no real ventilation. Once the engine's running, it adds its own heat, a constant mechanical blast that turns the air thick and dry, like you're breathing in the exhaust from a giant hairdryer. And then there's you, and your crew, 5 men packed close enough to swap sweat without touching. Every breath is warm. Every movement releases more body heat into the stale air. Helmets trap it around your head, uniforms stick to your skin, and you can feel the salt drying in the creases of your clothes. You're sweating so much that your socks are damp within the first hour, and not because you've stepped in anything. The smell shifts with the heat too. Whatever odours are trapped inside, oil, sweat, fuel, damp canvas, they get stronger. The heat wakes them up and pushes them into your nose with every breath. You taste it in your mouth, a faint metallic tang mixed with something sour. There's no breeze to carry it away. The only airflow comes from the fans that kick on when the engine's running, and they don't bring in fresh air. They just circulate the same hot, stale atmosphere around until it feels like you're living inside someone's exhaled breath. Your body starts reacting in small ways first. You feel sluggish. Your concentration slips. It's harder to follow orders because your brain is quietly shutting down parts of itself to keep your core temperature from climbing too high. Your hands get sweaty on the controls. Your shirt sticks to your back. And you find yourself counting the seconds until you can crack a hatch for air. But cracking a hatch isn't always an option. Out in the open, it's basically an invitation for a sniper or a piece of shrapnel to drop in and make itself at home. And the Italian summer doesn't care that you're in a war. The air outside is already heavy with heat before you even start moving. If you're lucky, there's some shade from olive groves or buildings. If you're not, you're crossing open fields where the sun bounces off the metal and doubles down on the temperature inside. It's not unusual for the interior to get hot enough to make you dizzy. The phrase "sweating buckets" stops being an exaggeration and becomes a measurable fact. Water doesn't stay cold for long. Your canteen is lukewarm within an hour, and after that, it's just another chore to force yourself to drink. But you do drink, because not drinking means you start feeling lightheaded, your vision goes a little fuzzy, and your stomach turns. You know what heat exhaustion feels like, and you know what comes after it: heat stroke. Neither is something you can afford in combat. You've heard the stories about guys passing out in the turret. It happens. The combination of sun, engine heat, and physical exertion from loading shells or cranking the turret can push a man over the edge in less than an hour if conditions are bad enough. And when you're in the middle of a fight, there's no time out for medical attention. If the loader goes down, someone else has to take over, and that someone is already busy with their own job. You just keep going, knowing the guy slumped in the corner might be one shell short of never waking up. You can't take off layers either. The uniform stays on, the helmet stays on, and in combat you keep your gear strapped in place. Some guys try loosening things a little, rolling sleeves up, unfastening collars. But there's only so much you can do without compromising safety. The irony is that the same steel that's baking you alive is also your only protection from bullets and shrapnel. You can't just step out for fresh air. That's how people die. The heat also messes with the tank itself. Metal expands, machinery gets hotter, and sometimes that means your equipment doesn't work quite the way it should. Ammunition gets warm, fuel tanks swell, and the inside smells more like a mechanic's shop on a sweltering day. You can feel the floor vibrating from the engine, the heat rising up through your boots. And if you've been sitting in one spot for too long, you can actually burn yourself on certain parts of the interior. At night, the heat doesn't vanish. The metal holds onto it for hours, radiating it back into the cramped space long after the sun's gone down. You think you'll get relief when the air cools outside, but inside it's still like lying in a hot bath you can't get out of. Your sweat dries in patches, leaving your skin itchy and raw. And then morning comes, and it starts all over again. You adapt in small ways. You learn to sip water constantly instead of gulping it. You shift your position so you're not pressing against the hottest parts of the hull. You tuck a rag under your helmet strap to stop the sweat from running into your eyes. You learn to recognize the signs in your crew, the pale look, the glassy eyes, the slower responses, and you nudge them to drink before they get too far gone. But the truth is, there's no real solution. You're just enduring it until the mission's over or the weather changes. And here's the part no one talks about. The heat makes you sloppy. You're slower to react, slower to think. You start making mistakes you wouldn't make in cooler conditions. You forget to check something. You miss a small sound that might have been important. You're more likely to lash out at someone for bumping into you because the discomfort has been building all day. In a tank crew, mistakes get people killed, and the heat is always there, waiting to wear you down enough to make one. You wonder sometimes if the enemy's got it any better. Probably not. A German tank in summer is just as miserable, but somehow that's not comforting. Because even if they're cooking in their armour, they can still hit you with a shell that turns this slow, roasting death into a quick, fiery one. When you finally do get a break, stepping out into the open air feels like freedom, even if it's still 90 degrees outside. At least the air moves. At least you can breathe without feeling like you're sucking it out of an exhaust pipe. You stand there for a minute, squinting in the sun, knowing you'll be back inside soon. Because no matter how bad the heat is, the alternative, being outside the armour when the shooting starts, is worse. And just when you think you've survived the worst the temperature can throw at you, the seasons change. The heat leaves, but you don't get comfort in its place. You get the cold, and the cold inside a Sherman is its own brand of punishment. Different, but just as miserable. You'd think that after sweating through a whole summer inside a Sherman, winter would feel like a relief. You're wrong. The cold isn't kinder. It's just a different way for the tank to make you miserable. The same steel walls that trapped all that summer heat now turn into giant slabs of refrigerated metal, sucking the warmth out of you the second you climb in. You're basically living inside a walk-in freezer that rattles, leaks, and occasionally tries to kill you. The first thing you notice is how fast the cold gets into everything. The seats feel like ice blocks. Your helmet feels like it's been sitting in a snowbank. The floor plates are so cold they seem to freeze through your boots, leaving your toes numb before the engine even starts. You try to shift your feet to keep the blood moving, but there's nowhere warm to put them. The cold doesn't just sit on your skin, it works its way into your bones. Breathing isn't pleasant either. Every exhale turns into a little cloud that hangs in the still air before drifting away. Your nose runs constantly, and wiping it is a joke because your gloves are stiff with cold and smell like fuel. Take the gloves off, and your hands start aching within seconds. Keep them on, and you lose half your dexterity, which is great when you're trying to handle delicate controls or load a 17mm shell without fumbling it. The engine helps a little, but not much. You'd think having a giant heat-producing machine running a few feet away would warm things up, but the warmth it produces is uneven at best. If you're sitting right next to a hot component, you might get a little relief on one side of your body while the other side stays frozen. If you're not near it, you might as well be outside, and any heat the engine does create is quickly stolen by the steel hull and sent right back out into the Italian winter air. Then there's condensation. Every breath, every bit of body heat, every drop of moisture in the air settles on the cold metal and turns into a thin layer of frost. That frost melts as soon as anything warms it up, and now you've got dampness on top of the cold. Your gloves are wet, your sleeves are wet, the seat under you is wet. It's like the tank has decided to add mild hypothermia to its list of features. You layer up, of course. Wool undergarments, extra socks, scarves, anything you can scrounge. But no matter how many layers you put on, the cold finds a way in. It sneaks through gaps in your uniform, creeps down your collar, and bites at your ears every time the commander cracks the hatch. And when you're wearing all that extra clothing, the cramped interior feels even smaller. You can't move as easily, and you're sweating just enough under all those layers that when you stop moving, that sweat turns cold and makes you even more miserable. Your fingers are the real problem. Try doing anything in the tank without using your fingers. You can't. And the moment they start going numb, everything gets harder. Adjusting sights, flipping switches, securing hatches, even holding your weapon becomes clumsy and slow. You start flexing them just to keep the feeling in, which is fine until you hit something metal. And then it's a sharp, bone-deep sting that makes you curse out loud. The worst is when you have to get out in the middle of it. Maybe you're doing maintenance. Maybe you're scouting. Maybe you just need to stretch your legs. The second you leave the tank, the wind cuts through you like a knife. Your boots crunch on frozen mud. Your breath comes out in ragged puffs, and your face goes numb. Then, just when you start to feel like the tank might actually be warmer than this, you climb back in, and the damp, stale, freezing air inside hits you all over again. And winter doesn't just sap your comfort, it messes with the tank. Cold metal is brittle. Engines are harder to start. Lubricants thicken until moving parts groan, like they're 100 years old. Optics fog up at the worst times, and if you're unlucky, they frost over entirely. You wipe them clear, but the cold just brings it back. The radio crackles more, the controls feel heavier, and the tracks creak as if they're complaining about being forced to move. Morale takes a hit in winter. Everyone's quieter, hunched deeper into their coats, conserving warmth and energy. Small talk dies off, because no one wants to open their mouth and let the warm air out. Even argument sounds slower, like the cold is dragging the words down. You don't really notice how much it's affecting you until you try to do something that would normally be easy and realise your brain is working at half speed. It's not just discomfort, it's fatigue, creeping in like frostbite. You start to dream about warmth the way you used to dream about fresh air in summer. You think about fires, about blankets, about sitting somewhere without your breath hanging in front of you. But like summer, there's no escape except waiting for the weather to change. And when it does, you'll trade the bone-deep chill for the slow, suffocating heat all over again. The seasons don't give you a break. They just take turns making you wish for the other one. And no matter the season, one thing stays the same: the terrain outside. The Italian countryside isn't just beautiful hills and charming villages, it's a nightmare for tanks. The ground you're driving on is about to become as big a problem as the weather. The movies never show this part. In the films, tanks glide smoothly across the battlefield, kicking up a little dust, while the crew fires off perfectly aimed shots at the enemy. In Italy, the only thing gliding is your hope for an easy ride. The terrain here hates tanks. It hates them in summer, it hates them in winter, and it definitely hates them in spring, when the mud starts eating vehicles whole. The first problem is the hills. Italy is full of them, not the gentle rolling kind that make for nice postcards, but steep, uneven slopes that seem designed specifically to make driving a 30-ton hunk of steel as awkward and exhausting as possible. Shermans can handle a lot, but they weren't built to be mountain goats. Going uphill means the engine's screaming, the tracks are clawing for grip, and the driver's praying he doesn't stall halfway up. Going downhill means you're basically in a slow-motion sled, trying not to pick up enough speed to end up in a tree, a ditch, or the back of the guy in front of you. The roads aren't much better. Most of them were built centuries before anyone thought about vehicles, let alone tanks. They're narrow, winding, and lined with stone walls that seem perfectly placed to scrape the paint off your hull. Passing another vehicle is a negotiation. Sometimes you manage it, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you're reversing half a mile because the road is too narrow for both of you. And that's if the road hasn't been shelled, mined, or blocked by rubble from a recently destroyed building. The villages are worse. Tanks were never meant to move through cramped medieval streets. You can barely turn the turret without hitting a wall, and half the time you can't get a clear line of sight without knocking down someone's front door. Every corner is blind, every alley is a potential ambush, and there's nowhere to manoeuvre if you get stuck. Infantry loves having a tank nearby for cover, but the feeling isn't mutual, because once you're boxed in, the only thing between you and a German anti-tank team is a prayer, and however fast your gunner can find the target. Then there's the mud. Italian mud isn't just wet dirt. It's a living, breathing thing that grabs your tracks and refuses to let go. In the wet season, one wrong move and you're bogged down up to the hull, the track spinning uselessly while the engine groans. Getting out usually means every man in the crew is outside with shovels, swearing at the ground and at each other, while keeping one eye out for anyone who might take advantage of the fact that you're now a stationary target. Sometimes another tank has to tow you out, which means everyone in the area now knows exactly where you are. And so do the enemy gunners. Rocky ground is no better. Sure, it won't swallow you like mud, but it'll chew up your tracks, shake the suspension, and rattle the entire crew until your teeth feel loose. Every bump sends someone's helmet into the side of the turret, or someone's elbow into the gun breech. If you thought the inside of a Sherman was uncomfortable when it was standing still, wait until you've spent 3 hours bouncing around like loose tools in a toolbox. The rivers are another nightmare. Italy has plenty of them, and the bridges aren't always built for something as heavy as a tank. Cross one that's too weak, and you're either swimming in cold, dirty water or sitting on a half-collapsed span waiting for engineers who may or may not have the time to fix it before the enemy shows up. And if you can't use a bridge, you're looking at fording, which means the water's probably high enough to flood the engine if you misjudge it by even a few inches. And of course, the enemy knows all this. They use the terrain like a weapon. German forces in Italy were masters of positioning. They'd set up anti-tank guns on high ground with perfect lines of sight, dig in behind stone walls, or plant mines in exactly the spots you'd have to cross. They didn't need to chase you. They just waited for the hills, the mud, the narrow roads, and the villages to slow you down. Every movement is a risk calculation. Do you take the long way around to avoid that steep slope, knowing it might add hours to your route? Do you push through the muddy road and hope you don't get stuck? Do you send infantry ahead to clear a village before you enter, or do you roll in blind and hope for the best? None of the options feel good. They all have a chance of ending with you climbing out of a burning tank. You get used to the constant jolting, the sharp turns, and the grinding sound of the tracks fighting for traction. You stop noticing the way the whole crew leans instinctively when the tank tilts too far to one side. You even stop swearing every time a branch smacks the side of the turret, or a rock bangs against the underside. But you never stop noticing how slow you're moving, how exposed you feel, and how much of your survival depends on whether the terrain lets you through. In the end, you don't conquer the Italian terrain. You make uneasy compromises with it. You crawl where you have to, push where you can, and pray the enemy's having just as much trouble on their side. And when the ground finally does let you pass, it's usually just to hand you off to the next nightmare. the fact that the Sherman itself was far from perfect when it came to armour. If the terrain hasn't already made you question why you ever agreed to sit inside this rolling box, meeting the Sherman's armour situation will. The M4 Sherman was built to be reliable, easy to produce, and able to be shipped anywhere in the world. Great for logistics, not so great when you're the one inside it, while German gunners are doing their best to turn you into a smoking crater. Here's the reality. The Sherman's armour was fine in 1942. Against early war German tanks, like the Panzer III and IV, it could take a hit and keep moving. But Italy in 1944 wasn't 1942. By now the Germans had Panthers, Tigers, and the dreaded 88mm guns mounted on everything from anti-tank cannons to self-propelled vehicles. And those guns didn't care about your armour. They went through a Sherman like a hot knife through butter. Actually, scratch that. Butter at least puts up a little resistance. On paper, the Sherman's frontal armour was about 50mm thick on early models, sloped to give it some extra deflection. Later versions had thicker plates, but by the time those rolled into Italy, the Germans had already adjusted. They didn't aim for a fair fight. They aimed for overkill. A well-placed shot from a Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun or a Tiger's 88mm could punch through your front plate from over a mile away. Side armour? Forget it. Even older German weapons could rip through that without breaking a sweat. And once they knew your weaknesses, the Germans started playing a game you couldn't win. They'd set up on high ground, behind stone walls, or at the end of a narrow street. You'd roll into view, maybe even spot them at the last second, and before you could say reverse, you'd hear the deafening clang of a hit, if you were lucky. If you weren't, you'd hear the much shorter, sharper sound of armour penetration, followed by a shower of metal fragments whipping through the inside of the tank, like a blender full of shrapnel. The Sherman was nicknamed Ronson by some crews, after the lighter brand. Light every time. Why? Because penetrating hits often ignited the fuel or ammo. Once a fire started, you had seconds to get out before the whole thing went up. That's not Hollywood drama. That's how quickly things happened. In Italy's tight streets and hilly terrain, you often didn't even have space to manoeuvre once you realised you were under fire. Commanders knew the Sherman's limits, so they came up with tactics to try to even the odds. That usually meant travelling in groups, using terrain for cover, and avoiding direct fights with heavier German armour. In theory, you'd let your faster mobility and numbers overwhelm the enemy. In practice, Italy didn't give you the wide open spaces you needed for that kind of fight. You'd be funneled into choke points, ambushed from above, or caught in positions where your speed didn't matter. Because reversing uphill in a tank is a slow motion nightmare. And here's the part that really eats at you. You know the enemy's gun outranges yours. If a Panther sees you first, it can fire from outside the range where you can reliably hit back. That means you're closing the distance under fire, hoping you either find cover or get lucky before the next shot. Every clang on the armour makes you wonder if this is the one that comes through. Every turn of the turret is a race to aim and fire before they do. It's not like the Sherman's gun was useless. The 75mm could handle most older German tanks and tear through infantry positions, bunkers, and light vehicles. But against Panthers and Tigers, you had to hit the side or rear to have any real chance. That meant flanking, which meant moving into more exposed positions, which meant inviting trouble from every other gun in the area. In Italy's maze of narrow valleys, stone villages, and ridgelines, getting around to someone's flank wasn't exactly a casual Sunday drive. Armour thickness wasn't the only issue. The quality of the steel itself sometimes varied. The US was cranking out Shermans by the thousands, and while the design was consistent, not every batch of armour plate was perfect. Sometimes you'd hear about tanks that took glancing hits just fine, and others that seemed to get punched through more easily than they should have. You never really knew which one you were sitting in until it was tested the hard way. And then there was the silhouette. The Sherman was tall, over 8 feet from the ground to the top of the turret. That made it roomy compared to some tanks, but it also made it easy to spot. In an Italian village, your turret could be visible over a wall or a hedge long before you saw what was on the other side. In open country, you stuck out against the horizon like a billboard that said, "Please shoot me." So you learned to respect cover like it was your best friend. You hugged buildings, crept along hedgerows, and used every rise in the ground to hide your approach. You peeked out just enough to aim, then backed up before someone could zero in on your position. But no matter how careful you were, there was always the chance that someone, somewhere, had the drop on you. And when they did, it wasn't just the armour penetration you had to worry about. The Sherman had another reputation that kept crews awake at night, the way it liked to catch fire when hit. That problem was bad enough that it deserves its own discussion, because if the armour didn't kill you, the flames probably would. If you thought the Sherman's armour situation was bad on its own, wait until you look at what was waiting for you on the other side. The Germans didn't just make guns to counter tanks. They made guns to humiliate them. By the time the fighting in Italy really got going, the Wehrmacht wasn't relying on old short-barrel panzer cannons anymore. They had the big ones, the scary ones, the ones that could punch through your armour so easily it felt personal. The most famous of them all, the 88. Even if you've never been in a tank, you've probably heard that number whispered like it's some kind of curse. That's because the 88mm gun wasn't just deadly, it was overachieving. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, it turned out to be disturbingly good at killing tanks. Long range, flat trajectory, pinpoint accuracy. If an 88 saw you first, you were already in trouble. In Italy, they were hidden in the hills, tucked behind stone walls, camouflaged in olive groves, anywhere they could get a clean line of sight to the narrow roads and valleys you were forced to use. And it wasn't just the famous 88s. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm was almost as terrifying, especially since the Panther had better armour than you and could hit you before you could reliably hit it. Then there were the Tigers with their big cat's egos and massive guns. Add in towed anti-tank guns like the Par 40, which could be set up in a small ditch or behind a pile of rubble. And suddenly, everywhere you went felt like a shooting gallery where you were the main attraction. The Germans didn't fight fair because they didn't have to. They knew your range, your weaknesses, your silhouette. They didn't sit out in the open and trade shots. They picked their ground. They waited until you were halfway through a narrow street or halfway up a hill where you couldn't turn or manoeuvre, and then they fired. Sometimes you didn't even know where the shot came from until you saw the smoke trail in the distance. By then, you were either dead or scrambling to get out of the kill zone before the next round arrived. Even when you thought you had the drop on them, it was risky. Their optics were better than yours. Their guns had faster muzzle velocities, and they were trained to aim for the spots that mattered. A shot to the lower front plate. A hit on the turret ring to jam it. A shell into the side armour where your ammo racks were sitting like a polite invitation to explode. One accurate round could turn the inside of the Sherman into a blender of hot metal fragments and smoke. You learned quickly that hearing a gunfire in the distance wasn't the scary part. It was hearing one fire and realising it was aimed at you. The sound of an incoming round is short, sharp, and has a weight to it. If you hear it and you're still breathing a second later, that's when you start moving. Fast. There's no time to figure out where it came from. You get into cover, you change your position, you do anything to make the next shot harder. The psychological effect was almost as bad as the physical threat. Every time you rolled out into the open, you could feel eyes on you. Maybe from a gun crew hidden in the tree line. Maybe from a tank you hadn't spotted yet. You didn't know if the next second would be quiet or end with a shell slamming into your hull. And the thing about German guns in Italy was that they almost always had the advantage of elevation. Shooting down at you meant they didn't have to hit square on to do damage. A glancing blow could still penetrate or at least knock something vital out of commission. The terrain made it even worse. Those narrow valleys and winding roads weren't just obstacles for you. They were perfect choke points for an enemy gunner. You'd round a bend, and there it was. A shot you couldn't dodge, because there was nowhere to go. If you were lucky, you could reverse, using smoke or cover from other tanks. If you weren't lucky, you got to find out firsthand why the phrase brewing up made every tanker's stomach drop. And here's the kicker. These guns didn't always need to destroy you outright. Immobilizing you was enough. A track hit, a damaged engine, anything to stop you moving. Then they could take their time finishing the job. Sitting still in a Sherman while the enemy reloads is like being tied to a post while someone sharpens a spear right in front of you. Every second feels like an hour, and every clang of metal somewhere on the hull might be the beginning of the end. So you adapted. You learned to keep moving, to use cover, to never stay exposed longer than absolutely necessary. You fired smoke to hide your retreat. You coordinated with infantry to spot enemy positions before you rolled into them. And you tried, desperately, to avoid the long, clear lines of sight where German guns excelled. But no matter how careful you were, there was always the chance that somewhere, hidden in the folds of the hills or the shadows of a ruined building, a German crew was already sighting in on you. And if they did hit you, that's when the real fear kicked in. Because even if the shot didn't kill you outright, there was a good chance it would light you on fire. And inside a Sherman, fire wasn't just a hazard, it was a death sentence. There's a reason Sherman crews had a special phrase for it. Brewing up. It sounds almost casual, like making tea. In reality, it meant the tank had just been turned into a rolling furnace, and you were inside it. When German gunners hit you in the right spot, you didn't just lose armour integrity. You lost the few precious seconds you had before heat, smoke, and flames made it impossible to get out. The Sherman had a bad reputation for catching fire, and it wasn't entirely undeserved. Early models stored ammunition in side racks along the hull, right where enemy shells liked to hit. A penetration there didn't just disable the tank, it ignited the propellant in the shells. The result was instant chaos, a bright flash, a wave of heat, and the inside filling with choking smoke so fast it felt like the air was being stolen from your lungs. If you've never seen it happen from the inside, You can't quite imagine how quickly it goes wrong. There's no dramatic pause, no slow spread of flames like in the movies. 1 second you're operating normally, the next you're in a room where the walls have caught fire. The smell is a mix of burning paint, scorched fabric, and cooked metal, and it hits you before you even fully register what's happening. The crew's only real defence was to get out fast. The problem? There's nothing fast about scrambling through a cramped steel box with 5 men all trying to leave at once. The driver and co-driver had narrow front hatches that were awkward to climb out of, even in perfect conditions. The gunner and loader had to squeeze past each other to reach the turret hatch, and the commander, if he was lucky enough to already be half out, usually got clear first. If you were unlucky, you were stuck behind someone else who couldn't move as quickly, and those few extra seconds could be the difference between escape and being trapped in a burning coffin. The fire itself wasn't the only killer. The smoke was thick, acrid, and deadly in its own right. 1 lungful could leave you coughing and gasping, your eyes streaming so badly you couldn't see the hatch. In the panic, it was easy to disorient yourself and waste precious seconds trying to figure out which way was out. And if the fire reached the fuel tanks or more ammunition, the resulting explosion didn't leave anyone inside with a chance. Crews tried to prepare for it, they practiced bailing out, they kept hatches unlatched when possible, and they even rode with their gear positioned to grab on the way out. But the truth was, there was only so much you could do when your tank became a torch. Later versions of the Sherman added wet stowage for ammunition, sealing it in water-jacketed bins to reduce the risk of ignition. It helped, but by the time those made it to Italy in significant numbers, plenty of crews had already learned the hard way why the reputation stuck. And the psychological weight of that reputation was constant. Every time you took a hit that didn't penetrate, you felt relief. Not just because you were still alive, but because the interior wasn't on fire yet. Every clang against the hull made your heart skip. Every hiss of escaping gas or whiff of smoke set your nerves on edge. You could fight through almost anything else. Mobility damage, a jammed turret, even a wounded crewman. But once fire took hold, you were on the clock, and the clock ticked fast. You heard stories from other crews. Sometimes they were warnings, sometimes they were rumours, and sometimes they were just grim little reminders of the job. A hit on a Sherman halfway across the valley, smoke billowing from the hatches, maybe 1 or 2 men making it out. The rest didn't. You'd pass the blackened wreck the next day, the paint gone, the metal warped, the inside gutted. And you'd think, that could be us tomorrow. It didn't help that Italian terrain made brewing up even more terrifying. Narrow roads and steep hills meant there were plenty of situations where you couldn't just drive forward or reverse quickly. If you caught fire in one of those spots, you weren't just fighting the flames. You were fighting gravity, obstacles, and the tank's own cramped design to get out before the whole thing went up. You didn't need to be hitting the ammo for fire to start either. Fuel leaks, oil spills, or even the intense heat from constant firing could set something off. A hit that sparked inside the crew compartment could ignite personal gear, rags, or spare clothing. And in seconds, you'd be in the same nightmare scenario. Once that first flame took hold, there was no fire extinguisher big enough or fast enough to put it out before the situation became terminal. Crews kept an eye on each other in combat for this reason. If the guy next to you suddenly froze or shouted "fire," everything else stopped. You dropped whatever you were doing and went for the hatch. There was no shame in abandoning the fight. A burning Sherman wasn't worth staying in for one more shot. And the fear of it was strong enough that sometimes you'd start moving before the commander even gave the order because you knew he was about to. It became part of your mental checklist. Is the tank moving? Is everyone still breathing? Is anything on fire? If that last question ever had even a hint of maybe as the answer, you weren't waiting to find out for sure. You were getting out. And the cruel part, even if you escaped, the fire usually meant the tank was gone for good. A burned out Sherman wasn't getting repaired in the field. If it wasn't a total loss, it was still out of action for weeks. That meant one less tank in your unit, one less crew to share the load, and a reminder for everyone still in the fight that they were sitting in the same thin-skinned, easily ignited box. If the fire didn't get you, something else might, because even without burning, being hit often meant you were trapped inside with all the ammo, fuel, and metal shards you could ever need to turn a bad day into your last one. If the fire problem wasn't enough to keep you up at night, the ammo situation inside a Sherman made sure you never forgot that you were basically sitting on top of your own execution device. The whole point of a tank is to bring firepower to the fight, but in a Sherman, that firepower was stacked, stored, and crammed into every available nook, in a way that made you constantly aware of how much high explosive death was sitting inches from your knees. In the early models, ammunition was stored in side racks along the inside of the hull, right at about waist height. Sounds convenient, right? Easy to grab, easy to load. But convenience comes with a catch. It's also exactly where enemy shells tend to hit. When a German round punched through your armour at that level, it didn't just make a hole. It hit the ammo directly. That meant propellant igniting, shells cooking off, and the inside of the tank turning into an impromptu fireworks display that no one wanted tickets for. The shells themselves weren't small. A 75 mm or 76 mm shell isn't something you can just tuck away in a safe corner. They're heavy, awkward, and each one is basically a carefully packaged explosion. Multiply that by the dozens you needed to keep fighting, and you're talking about enough stored energy to level a building, all packed inside a steel box with you. And because of the cramped quarters, sometimes you had to sit on the ammo, rest your legs against it, or wedge your gear around it. You got real familiar with those shells, not in a proud owner way, but in a please don't go off while I'm touching you way. In combat, the loader's job was to keep the gun fed, which meant pulling rounds out of those racks and into the breach as fast as possible. That also meant that during a fight, ammo was often left out of the racks, on the floor, in someone's lap, leaning against a bulkhead. If you took a hit during that chaos, loose rounds could detonate just as easily as stored ones. And if the fire spread anywhere near them, you didn't get a second chance. Crews weren't blind to this problem. They knew the side racks were basically giant shoot here for instant kill signs. Later in the war, the US introduced wet stowage, where ammo was stored in water-jacketed bins under the turret floor. This made it harder for a penetrating hit to ignite the shells right away, and it helped reduce the number of catastrophic fires. But in Italy, plenty of Shermans were still using the older, more dangerous layouts, and those were the ones most crews had to fight in. Even with safer storage, the psychological pressure never went away. You were always aware that if something punched through in the wrong place, you'd go from combat ready to smoking crater in seconds. Every clang on the armour at ammo level made your stomach knot. Every time you smelled something burning, you glanced toward the racks, because if they went, you wouldn't even have time to swear before it was over. There was also the problem of secondary explosions. Even if the initial hit didn't kill you, if it ignited 1 or 2 rounds, the blast could set off the rest. It was a chain reaction. One bang leading to a bigger bang, leading to the kind of explosion that made bystanders duck for cover 200 yards away. From the outside, it looked like the tank had been swallowed by a sudden fireball. From the inside, you wouldn't have seen much at all. Handling the ammo in normal conditions wasn't exactly safe either. Moving shells in and out of the racks meant dealing with their awkward size and weight, often in the middle of rough terrain. Drop one, and while it probably wouldn't go off without a primer strike, you'd still get a collective gasp from the crew like you'd just juggled a live grenade. And when you were resupplying in the field, you had to manhandle crates full of them into the already packed interior, finding space where space didn't exist. Every tank crewman knew that in theory, the armour was there to protect them from the enemy. In practice, you were just as worried about what you were carrying inside. The Germans didn't have to aim for your crew. All they had to do was hit the racks. And the moment you felt that telltale impact, at just the wrong height and angle, your thoughts went straight to the dozens of shells sitting right next to your leg. It made you move differently. You angled your tank when possible, so the enemy would hit thicker armour instead of the ammo racks. You parked in ways that kept the vulnerable side out of sight. You didn't linger in the open, because every second was another chance for someone to thread a shot into that one spot that would end you in a flash. And all of this tied into another nightmare scenario. Even if you weren't killed instantly, getting hit in the right place could disable the tank, leaving you stuck inside with all the ammo and no way to move. Which brings us to one of the most terrifying realities of tanking in Italy. What happened when you got trapped? When you're in a Sherman, you don't think about the armour as something that will keep you safe forever. You think of it as a timer, one that starts ticking the second you roll into combat. Every hit eats away at that time. And when the wrong hit comes, the clock stops. Not because you're dead yet, but because the tank can't move and you're stuck inside it. That's when the real panic sets in. Getting immobilised in Italy didn't just mean your tank was out of the fight. It meant you'd just become the juiciest stationary target in the valley. And you know what stationary targets are to an enemy gun crew with good range and all the time in the world? Free practice. A mobility kill could happen in a lot of ways. A hit to the track was the classic one. One shell in the right spot and the track links snapped or bent, the sprocket jammed, or the idler wheel crumpled. Sometimes it didn't even take a direct shell hit. A mine under one track could do the same job, tossing you to one side with a jolt that knocked your teeth together. Other times it was a lucky artillery fragment, or even a chunk of rubble from a nearby blast getting sucked into the running gear. Once you heard the grinding, squealing death rattle of a damaged track, you knew you weren't going anywhere. Engine hits were another nightmare. The Sherman's engine sat at the rear, and while it was somewhat protected, a well-placed round or a big enough piece of shrapnel could disable it in seconds. Even worse, an engine hit could lead to a fuel fire, and we've already covered how well that ends. Sometimes it wasn't even enemy fire that stopped you. Overheating on a steep climb, a busted transmission, or a suspension failure on rocky terrain could leave you stranded in the worst possible place. Inside, the moment you realise you're stuck, the atmosphere changes. If the tank's still taking fire, you feel every hit differently now. When you were moving, you had the illusion that speed and manoeuvre could keep you alive. Now, you're just waiting for the next shell to come through somewhere vital. Every clang, every metallic screech sounds closer. You're picturing exactly where the enemy gunner is aiming. The hatches suddenly feel smaller. They're already cramped, awkward openings at the best of times. In combat, with the turrets stuck at a bad angle or debris falling on top of you, they can shrink to the size of a nightmare. If the tank's been hit hard enough to warp the hull, a hatch might jam completely. Now you're not just stuck, you're trapped in a smoking metal box that's drawing every hostile eye in the area. If someone in the crew is wounded or unconscious, the situation gets even harder. You can't just leave them, but dragging a full-grown man in combat gear through the maze of cramped positions inside a Sherman is no small feat. Every second you spend hauling him toward a hatch is a second the enemy is reloading. You're not thinking about the glory of saving a comrade. You're thinking about whether you'll both make it out before the next round punches through. And if the tank's already on fire, that's when the real horror kicks in. Smoke fills the compartment fast. Your eyes sting, your lungs burn, and the whole interior seems to tilt and shrink at the same time. You're not climbing out in an orderly way now. You're clawing, scrambling, shoving your way toward any escape, praying your boots find the next rung of the ladder or the next foothold on instinct alone. Some crews kept escape drills sharp for this reason. They practiced getting out in seconds, rehearsed who went first, who covered the others, and how to grab the wounded. In theory, it was efficient. In practice, chaos had a way of shredding those plans. Adrenaline doesn't care about order. Panic doesn't care about training. If someone freezes, if someone gets stuck, if the turret's facing the wrong way, all those precious seconds vanish. You'd think you could just bail out and hide behind the tank, but a disabled Sherman is like a neon sign saying, "Shoot here." The enemy knows you'll try to use it for cover, so they keep firing until it's nothing but a blackened wreck. If you're unlucky enough to be trapped inside until then, you don't get the luxury of choosing how you go. Even without fire or direct hits, being stuck in a tank under fire does something to your head. You hear the whine of incoming rounds, the dull thud of impacts, the shrapnel scraping across the armour. You start counting them without realising it, wondering if the next one will be the one that finally punches through. It's claustrophobia with a side of Russian roulette. When rescue comes, if it comes, it's rarely dramatic. Maybe another tank rolls up to tow you out while you and the crew crouch low inside, praying the towing cable holds and the driver keeps it steady. Maybe infantry clears the way enough for you to limp to a safer position. Or maybe you're forced to abandon it entirely, sprinting for cover while shells keep slamming into the place you just left. And the thing is, none of this happens in slow motion like in the movies. It's over in moments, one way or another. Either you're back in the fight, you're running for your life, or you're not running at all. And even when you're moving again, the threat isn't gone. A Sherman could be fully functional and still lose a battle against another, quieter enemy, one that didn't blow holes in you, but could still leave you deaf, confused, and vulnerable. The breakdown of communication when you needed it most. If there's one thing you learn fast inside a Sherman, It's that staying alive depends just as much on talking as it does on shooting. You can have the best crew in the world, but if you can't get information from one end of the tank to the other, or from your tank to the next one in the column, you're basically driving blind. And in Italy, blind means you're either about to hit a mine, drive into an ambush, or block the only escape route you've got. Inside the tank, everyone has a job and a position, and that position comes with a certain level of isolation. The driver and co-driver are down in the hull, heads mostly in their own little world of pedals, levers, and narrow vision blocks. The gunner's locked into his sight, seeing nothing but a small slice of the battlefield. The loader is half buried in ammo racks, trying not to trip over loose shell casings. The commander's the only one who can stick his head up for a full view, but he's also juggling spotting, giving orders, and keeping the rest of you alive. Without the intercom system, you're shouting over engine noise, turret rotation, and the constant metallic clangs of movement. And shouting doesn't work in combat. The tank's interior is loud enough when you're idling. Once the engine's roaring, the tracks are clattering, and the main gun fires, it's a sensory overload. If the intercom goes down, it's like cutting the nervous system in half. Suddenly, orders don't get where they need to go. The driver can't hear when to slow down or turn. The gunner doesn't know which target the commander's pointing at. The loader's waiting for a fire command that never comes. Sometimes the breakdown wasn't just inside the tank. It was between tanks. In theory, your radio kept you in touch with your platoon, your company, and whoever was coordinating the attack. In reality, radios could be temperamental, especially in rough terrain. Static, interference, broken components. All of it meant that the message you needed right now might be nothing but a garbled hiss. And if you were in the middle of a fight, there was no climbing out to jiggle the antenna or bang the radio casing until it worked again. Bad timing made it lethal. Communication failures always seemed to happen when you were approaching a blind corner, crossing open ground, or rolling into a village where every second counted. You'd hear a few words, maybe enemy and left, and that was it. Was the enemy on your left? Coming from the left? Did they mean your left or the platoon's left? You don't get clarification. You get a choice between stopping in place like a target or guessing and hoping you don't end up with a tiger staring you in the face. Sometimes it was worse. Silence. Nothing but the background crackle of the radio and the constant noise of your own tank. You didn't know if the other tanks in your unit were gone, out of range, or just too busy staying alive to talk. That silence could make you feel like the last tank on Earth, even if your buddies were just a hill away. And if you did try to signal visually, forget it. In Italy's narrow valleys and dense villages, there was no line of sight to half the people you needed to reach. Even inside the tank, the intercom wasn't perfect. The headsets were uncomfortable, the cords got in the way, and sometimes a bad connection made everything sound like you were talking through a sock. Add gunfire, ricochets, and the constant engine vibration, and it wasn't hard to miss a critical order. A 1-second delay might not sound like much, but in a tank fight, it's the difference between getting the first shot off and being on the receiving end. When communications went down completely, you were forced into hand signals, banging on the hull, or relying on the commander's frantic pointing. It worked in a pinch, but it slowed everything down. And in Italy, slowing down could be fatal. The enemy didn't wait for you to sort your radio issues out. They just kept firing. It wasn't just a combat problem either. Bad comms could get you lost, separated from your unit, or rolling into an area you weren't supposed to be in. With the terrain already funneling you into predictable routes, a wrong turn or a missed warning was the kind of mistake that could turn your tank into a very obvious, very isolated target. Crews got used to redundancy, repeating orders twice, pointing even when you said it out loud, confirming with a "got it" over the headset. But even then, the unpredictability of radio reliability meant you never fully trusted that the plan you started with was the plan you were still on. In a perfect world, communication in a tank battle is crisp, fast and constant. In Italy, it was sometimes a prayer shouted into the void, hoping someone heard it before things went bad. And if things went bad and you lived through it, you'd quickly find yourself dealing with another kind of misery. Not enemy fire, not a breakdown, but the slow, grinding discomfort of the food situation. Because no matter how tough you thought you were, living on Sherman rations in Italy was its own quiet punishment. If combat didn't wear you down, the food would. People like to imagine soldiers in World War II eating hearty stews in mess tents, maybe a loaf of bread baked that morning, steaming mugs of coffee. Sure, maybe if you were back at a big base or happened to stumble into a friendly farmhouse. But for tank crews grinding their way through the hills and valleys of Italy, your diet was whatever you could carry, whatever wouldn't spoil, and whatever could be shoved into a corner of the hull without getting in the way of ammo or tools, which meant most of the time you were living on canned rations, and not the good kind. The Army's official term was sea rations, but most crews had other names for them that can't really be repeated in polite company. The cans came in a variety of flavours in theory, but variety was a cruel joke. You'd get beef stew, hash, pork and beans, or the dreaded meat and beans that tasted like someone tried to trap regret in a can, and no matter the label, once you cracked it open, it all had the same dull brown colour and the same smell. That weird metallic tang mixed with whatever overcooked mystery meat was floating inside. Heating them up was supposed to make them better, but heating food inside a Sherman wasn't exactly a gourmet process. You didn't have a stove, you had the tank's engine, and if you were lucky, maybe a little solid fuel stove you could light outside when things were quiet. Most of the time you just set the can somewhere near the engine compartment and let it warm up from the ambient heat. The downside? That meant your beef stew picked up a nice undertone of oil fumes and hot metal. Cold rations were worse. On long days, especially if you were moving constantly, there was no time to stop and heat anything. You just popped the can, fished out the contents with whatever utensil you had clean, or at least cleanish, and swallowed it down while the tank bounced you around. You stopped tasting it after a while. It became fuel, nothing more. You ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. The bread component came as bread discs, essentially dense, dry hockey pucks that technically qualified as baked goods, but were closer to cardboard in texture. They didn't go stale because they were already stale the moment they were made. Most guys just dunked them in coffee or stew to soften them up enough to chew without cracking a tooth. Speaking of coffee, the instant coffee packets were their own adventure. Add hot water, stir, and you'd get a vaguely brown liquid that tasted like someone whispered coffee into a cup of warm mud. Still, it was caffeine, and caffeine kept you going. You learned not to care about flavour. Sugar and candy sometimes made it into the ration packs, usually in the form of a rock-hard chocolate bar or gum that lost its flavour after 30 seconds. They were more morale boosters than actual nutrition. A small reminder that the world outside the tank wasn't entirely grey and oily. When you were lucky enough to be near supply lines, fresh food might show up. Bread that didn't come in a vacuum-sealed bag, fruit that hadn't been bruised into mush, real meat that didn't swim in gelatinous broth. Those moments were rare enough that crews remembered them for weeks afterward. The rest of the time, it was the same cans, the same bread discs, the same burnt, engine-warmed coffee. Italy teased you with the smells of its own food. Rolling through villages, you'd catch whiffs of baking bread, roasting meat, garlic in the air. The kind of cooking that made you ache for a meal that didn't come from a government-issued tin. Sometimes locals would trade with you. A loaf of bread for a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of wine for some chocolate bars. But you couldn't rely on that, especially in contested areas where the locals weren't exactly thrilled to see anyone in uniform, no matter which side they were on. So you ate your canned stew and bread discs, trying not to think too much about what was in them. The labels said beef or pork, but after a while you stopped reading. It didn't matter. It was fuel for the machine. And by machine, I mean both the tank and you. And as long as you could keep eating, you could keep going. But food wasn't the only comfort you were short on. Sleep was the other big one. And just like your diet, it wasn't about quality. It was about whether you got any at all, which brings us to the other constant grind of life in a Sherman. Trying to rest when the war doesn't care if you're tired. If you think eating mystery meat every day was demoralising, try going days, sometimes weeks, without a real wash. Forget the posters of sharp, uniformed soldiers with pressed collars and clean shaves. That's recruitment fantasy. The reality for a Sherman crew in Italy was that hygiene wasn't on the priority list unless you counted scraping mud off your boots before it jammed the pedals. The problem starts with space. There's no sink in a Sherman. No place to wash your hands except maybe a canteen and a rag that's been used for wiping oil off a wrench 5 times already. You can't exactly bring a bathtub with you. And even if you could, where would you put it? Next to the ammo rack? Most days, washing meant splashing a handful of lukewarm canteen water onto your face and calling it good. If you were feeling ambitious, maybe you'd give your neck a swipe too. Showers were a rare luxury, usually only happening when you were pulled far enough from the front to hit a proper camp. Even then, you were sharing with dozens of other guys. The water might be cold, and you had to be quick. You learned to get in, soap up, rinse off, and get out before the next guy started yelling. On the rare occasions you stumbled across a stream or a farmhouse with a basin of water, you used it. Not because you cared about smelling nice, but because the grime was starting to feel like a second skin. Clothes were another problem. Tank uniforms soaked up sweat, oil, and dust until they could practically stand up on their own. You wore them for days without changing, because you didn't have a closet full of spares. At best, you had 1 extra set, and even that got dirty fast. Washing clothes in the field meant dunking them in whatever water you could find, wringing them out, and hoping they dried before you had to move again. Usually you just wore them dirty and got used to the smell, yours and everyone else's. The combination of sweat, grease and engine fumes meant you carried a permanent smell that could probably be identified from 30 feet away. Your hands were never fully clean. No matter how many times you wiped them, there was always a faint trace of fuel, metal, and the odd grit of gunpowder residue. Your fingernails stayed black around the edges, and you eventually stopped noticing. Shaving was optional, at least in practice. The army might have liked the idea of a clean shave, but no one was chasing you down with a razor when you were halfway up a mountain in enemy territory. Some guys carried little travel razors and did a quick scrape when they had the time, usually using cold water and whatever mirror they could balance on a hatch. Others just let it grow, figuring the stubble was the least of anyone's problems. Toilets? That's another fun one. Inside a Sherman, there's no such thing. If nature called and you were buttoned up, you made do with whatever container you had, which was not a glamorous process. When you had the chance, you'd dig a hole somewhere private. If private meant being 30 yards from the tank while everyone else pretended not to notice. In cities, you might find a building to duck into, but that carried its own risks if the area wasn't fully secure. Illness was inevitable. With no regular showers, no clean uniforms, and limited water for washing hands, everyone got the occasional rash or stomach trouble. Cuts and scrapes got infected faster than you'd expect. You'd wipe grease off a finger with the same rag you used to clean your mess kit, then eat with that hand because there was no other option. It wasn't about being careless, it was about survival priorities. Hygiene came dead last when shells were flying. You learned to live with the grime because there was no alternative. It became part of you, just like the smell of fuel, the constant engine vibration, and the metallic taste that never quite left your mouth. You didn't think about being clean anymore. You thought about being alive. And that's the thing. Even if you could somehow get clean for a few minutes, the tank would take it away from you in an hour. The heat, the sweat, the grease, it was all waiting to cover you again as soon as you climbed back in. Not that you had much time to worry about it, because the moment you did stop moving, the exhaustion caught up to you. And sleeping inside a Sherman, well, that wasn't rest. That was just the body shutting down until the next job came along. If you think you're going to get a good night's sleep in a Sherman, you're either new here or lying to yourself. The tank isn't built for rest. It's built for moving, shooting, and keeping you alive long enough to do those things again. Sleep is just something you squeeze in when the tank stops long enough for the crew to stop moving. And in Italy, with its endless hills, narrow roads, and constant threat of ambush, that wasn't very often. First, there's the space issue. You've got 5 grown men in a steel box that wasn't designed for comfort. The seats are hard, the floor is harder, and everything you might lean against is either cold metal or covered in grease. The turret basket, that ring of flooring inside the rotating part of the tank, is full of gaps and protrusions. So lying there is like sleeping on a pile of pipes. You can't stretch out fully unless you're one of the lucky ones who gets to sling a sleeping bag across the engine deck outside, and that's only if the weather and the situation let you. Inside, you sleep where you sit. The driver and co-driver might lean back in their seats, heads against the hull, legs crammed under the controls. The loader might curl up in the small space between the ammo racks and the gun breech. The commander might slump forward over the radio. You're not tucking yourself in, you're just shutting down until something wakes you up, and something always wakes you up. Noise is constant in a Sherman. Even with the engine off, there's the clink of cooling metal, the faint hiss of fuel lines, the rattle of loose gear. Outside, there's the sound of distant gunfire, boots on gravel, or the occasional engine from another vehicle moving nearby. Your brain never fully relaxes because it's always half listening for the one sound that means trouble. The sharp crack of a nearby rifle, the deep thump of artillery, or the gut punch boom of a shell hitting too close. When the engine's running, forget about real rest. The roar is constant, the vibration runs through your bones, and the heat makes you sweat even when you're sitting still. You can nod off in that environment, but it's more like passing out than sleeping. And if you do drift off, the next jolt of the tracks over rough ground will snap you awake. Outside sleeping has its own risks. Some guys preferred it, lying on the ground next to the tank or on top of the engine deck under a blanket. You could stretch out, breathe fresher air, and maybe avoid some of the claustrophobic heat. But you were also more exposed to the weather, to insects, and to the unpleasant surprise of being spotted by the enemy in the middle of the night. More than a few tankers woke up to incoming fire or had to scramble back inside in the dark, tripping over gear as the commander shouted for everyone to button up. Your body never really recovers when you sleep like this. You might get a couple hours at a time, maybe more if you're lucky and the front is quiet, but it's never deep rest. You wake up stiff, sore, and still tired. The smell of the tank, oil, fuel, sweat, and metal clings to you. Your clothes are damp from humidity or sweat, your face gritty from dust. You start the day already worn out, and by the end of it, you're just more worn out than you were before. Sometimes you'd get a break in the form of an actual bed. Maybe a farmhouse with a spare room, or a captured building that hadn't been shelled into dust. You'd crash hard in those moments, sleeping like a dead man for as long as you could. But those moments were rare, and they always ended with someone shaking you awake too soon because it was time to move again. Fatigue did more than make you miserable. It made you sloppy. Your reaction time slowed. You missed small details. You forgot to check something important. And in a Sherman, mistakes like that could get you or the whole crew killed. But there was no fixing it. You couldn't just order 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep when you were crawling up a mountainside toward the next fight. So you learned to sleep anywhere, any time, in any position, because you had to. A 15-minute doze leaning against the gun breech was better than nothing. A quick nap on the back deck while the tank idled was worth the risk. You took what you could get, because tomorrow you'd be running on whatever scraps of rest you'd managed to grab. And that constant low-level exhaustion blended into everything. Eating, fighting, thinking. Even when you weren't in immediate danger, the tiredness was a weight you carried everywhere. It dulled the edges of fear and discomfort, but it never went away. And when the next fight came, you didn't get to shake it off. You just added adrenaline on top of it and hoped it was enough to get you through, which, in Italy, meant you were probably rolling straight into another kind of enemy, one that didn't have to shoot you to make your life miserable, the weather. There's loud, and then there's tank loud. The Sherman wasn't just noisy, it was a constant assault on your hearing from the moment the engine turned over until the day you climbed out for the last time. People imagine gunfire or explosions as the main source of battlefield noise, and sure, those were bad. But in a Sherman, the sound that got to you wasn't just the big, sudden bangs. It was the endless mechanical roar, the grinding, the rattling, a noise that seeped into your skull and stayed there until you couldn't tell the difference between what was outside your head and what was inside it. The engine was the biggest culprit. The M4 Sherman came with different engines depending on the variant. Radial aircraft engines, diesel engines, Ford V8s. But they all had one thing in common. They were loud enough to make your chest vibrate. When it was idling, you could talk to the guy next to you if you leaned in close. When it was moving, you could forget about conversation without an intercom. It wasn't just noise you heard, it was noise you felt, running through the floor plates and up your legs until you were carrying the vibration in your bones. Then there was the track noise, steel on steel, clattering over rocks, scraping against pavement, slamming into potholes. Every movement came with a metallic racket that never stopped. The sound echoed through the hull, amplified until it felt like you were inside a giant drum someone was beating with hammers. And over rough Italian terrain, the tracks were almost always hitting something that made them sing, screech, or bang in ways you couldn't tune out. The gun wasn't quiet either. Firing the main cannon was an event. A single massive blast that rattled your teeth and left your ears ringing no matter how many times you'd heard it before. You braced for it when you knew it was coming, but the shock still slammed into you every time. Inside the enclosed space of the turret, the concussion was magnified. You could feel the air pressure change, a momentary thump in your chest that mixed with the deafening crack. Machine guns had their own special bite. The 30 caliber coaxial or hull-mounted guns rattled and chattered like they were trying to shake the tank apart. The 50 caliber up top was worse. Not just loud, but sharp. Each shot snapping a punch of sound that you felt in your jaw. In theory, you were wearing a headset that helped muffle it. In reality, the headset could only do so much. And it wasn't just combat. Even on the move, the noise never let up. The turret gears whined as they traversed. The suspension groaned. Tools clanged against the hull. And loose gear rattled with every bump. Every sound bounced off the steel walls and back at you. Trapped and amplified until the inside of the tank was its own private storm of metallic chaos. After a while, the noise did something to you. Your ears stopped registering it as individual sounds and turned it into a constant background roar. But that didn't mean it went away. It wore you down slowly, fraying your nerves, making you jumpy even when things were quiet. And quiet was its own problem. If you'd been in the tank long enough, true silence didn't feel right anymore. You'd step out, hear nothing but wind or distant birds, and feel uneasy, like you were missing something important. Hearing damage was almost guaranteed. Crews didn't have the kind of advanced hearing protection soldiers use today. The best you could do was your headset, and that was for communication, not saving your hearing. After weeks or months of tank life, you started to notice a permanent ringing in your ears. A faint, high-pitched tone that followed you even when you tried to sleep. Some guys never lost it. Others lost more than just the ringing. They lost chunks of their hearing altogether. The noise also made you tired in ways you didn't expect. Constant sound meant your brain never fully shut down, even when you weren't in immediate danger. That mental strain stacked up over time. Add it to the poor sleep, the physical discomfort, and the stress of combat, and you had a recipe for complete exhaustion. The only way to escape it was to get out of the tank. And even then, the quiet felt temporary. You knew the second you climbed back in and the driver hit the starter, the roar would be back, filling every corner of your world. And the worst part? You got used to it. Not in a good way. In the way someone gets used to carrying a weight they can never put down. It became part of life, and you stopped noticing how much it was breaking you until you were away from it, and realised you'd been living inside a noise you couldn't turn off. And if the noise didn't get you, the environment outside was more than happy to take its shot. Because in Italy, you weren't just fighting the Germans. You were fighting the country itself. The Sherman wasn't a drive-it-and-forget-it machine. It needed constant attention, and the Italian campaign was a masterclass in finding out just how quickly something could break when you needed it most. You couldn't just hand the keys to a mechanic and wait in the mess hall. You and your crew were the mechanics, and if the tank didn't work, you weren't going anywhere. Which meant a big part of tank life wasn't fighting. It was keeping the damn thing running, often in the middle of nowhere, with the enemy a few hills away. The tank's moving parts were always wearing down. Tracks through links, engines overheated, suspension bogies cracked, guns jammed, radios fizzled out, and electrical systems decided to stop cooperating at the worst times. In Italy, all of that was made worse by the terrain. The steep inclines, sharp turns, and endless bumps meant your suspension took a beating every single day. And with the mud, rocks, and dust constantly working their way into every moving part, you were always one step behind the next breakdown. Field repairs were never clean, never easy, and never on your schedule. A thrown track meant stopping wherever you were and getting out to fix it, which in tank country could mean crouching in the open with enemy spotters somewhere on the ridge, just waiting for a reason to call in artillery. Throwing a track in a village was bad enough. Throwing one halfway up a mountain road where you couldn't even turn the tank properly was worse. You'd have to wrestle the heavy, grease-coated links back into place, sweating under your gear, straining every muscle, and knowing you were a very visible target the whole time. The tools weren't exactly ergonomic either. You had what the army gave you, plus whatever extras you could scrounge. Wrenches the size of baseball bats, pry bars, hammers, and a jack that never seemed to be quite big enough for the job. Working on a tank meant lifting, shoving, and hammering parts into place, while oil and grease coated your hands. You learned quickly that you weren't just going to get dirty, you were going to stay dirty. Sometimes the job was inside the tank, which meant twisting yourself into impossible shapes to reach a stubborn bolt or a jammed component. The loader might have to crawl under the gun breech, the driver might have to snake his arms into the engine compartment from inside, and the commander might be half hanging out of a hatch, holding a flashlight in his teeth. And if the problem was in the engine bay, you could count on it being hot enough to make you sweat just from leaning over it. Replacing parts was another headache. Supply wasn't always where you needed it to be, and Italy's terrain meant resupply trucks couldn't just drive up whenever you broke something. More than once, crews resorted to cannibalizing wrecked tanks for whatever they needed, pulling a track link off a burned-out Sherman, scavenging a working radio from one that had taken a mobility kill, or swapping out a road wheel from a wreck that hadn't been hit too hard. All of this had to happen fast, because the longer you sat still, the more likely someone was going to drop a shell on you. You'd work with one ear tuned to the sound of distant artillery, knowing that if it started getting closer, you'd have to abandon the repair and run for cover. Sometimes you were lucky and could work at night, using minimal light to avoid drawing attention. Other times, the breakdown happened in broad daylight, and you just had to trust that no one was watching too closely. Even routine maintenance was a challenge. Greasing the suspension, checking track tension, cleaning the gun, and keeping the radio working were all daily or near daily jobs. Skip them, and you'd pay for it later, usually at the worst possible time. So you did them, even if it meant lying in the mud, under the tank, or climbing up top in freezing wind to check the .50 caliber. The irony was that the Sherman was considered one of the more reliable tanks of the war. And it was, in the sense that it would keep running if you constantly worked on it. But that reliable label didn't account for the hours you spent in the cold, in the heat, or under fire just to keep it that way. And even when the tank was running perfectly, that didn't mean you could move freely. In Italy, mobility wasn't just about the machine. It was about where you were trying to take it. And there were plenty of places that made you question whether the Sherman belonged there at all. The funny thing about tank warfare in Italy is that you didn't spend most of your time in full-blown combat. A lot of it was waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for fuel, waiting for the infantry to catch up, waiting for the weather to clear, waiting for the engineers to fix a road or a bridge. And in that waiting, morale and fear lived side by side, gnawing at you in different ways. The waiting wasn't peaceful. You were always in this tense middle ground, close enough to the front to know things could go bad fast, but far enough from the actual fighting that your mind started to wander. You had just enough time to think about all the ways things could go wrong, but not enough distraction to forget about it. Sometimes the waiting was out in the open, parked in a field, on a ridge, or halfway down a narrow road where you couldn't turn around if you wanted to. Other times, it was tucked behind a building, or in a tree line, hatches cracked open for a little air, while everyone sat around pretending not to notice how quiet it was. The commander might scan with binoculars, the gunner might check his sights, the loader might go through the ammo racks again just to kill time. The driver and co-driver would lean in their seats, eyes flicking between their controls and the little slits of view they had. The longer you sat still, the more your mind shifted. The tension never went away, but it changed shape. At first, you were alert, listening for anything unusual. Gunfire in the distance, the sound of an approaching vehicle, the faint whistle of incoming artillery. But after hours of nothing, your brain got restless. You started thinking about home, about the last letter you got, about the meal you'd kill for right now. Then something small would happen, a bird flying too close, a crack of wood from somewhere nearby, and your nerves would snap back into high gear like a rubber band. Morale in those moments was fragile. The tank was your home, your weapon, and your lifeline, but it was also your prison. You couldn't stretch out, you couldn't really relax, and the constant noise and smell reminded you that you were living in a machine designed for destruction. Some crews kept spirits up with jokes, card games, or sharing whatever food or drink they had. Others just sat in silence, each man in his own thoughts. Fear wasn't always the Hollywood kind where you're bracing for impact. It was quieter, heavier. It sat in the back of your mind while you were eating, talking, or checking your gear. You knew that at any second the stillness could break. Maybe it would be an artillery barrage. Maybe it would be an anti-tank gun opening up from somewhere you couldn't see. Maybe it would be a mine under your track when you finally started moving again. The worst part was knowing you wouldn't get much warning. Some crews handled that fear by doubling down on their routines, checking and rechecking the gun, cleaning their weapons, making sure every shell was in place. Others got restless, climbing out of the tank to pace around it, smoke a cigarette, or scan the hills with binoculars. The commander's job was to keep everyone ready without letting them spiral into nerves, which was easier said than done when you were feeling it too. You didn't talk much about the fear itself. You joked about it, sure. You'd call your Sherman a rolling coffin, or make bets on which of you would get stuck in the hatch first if you had to bail. But you didn't sit there and say, "I'm scared," because everyone already knew. It wasn't about hiding it, it was about not feeding it. And when the waiting finally ended, it didn't happen gradually. It happened all at once. In 1 minute you're sitting there, thinking about the last time you had fresh bread, and the next minute you're hearing the commander's voice through the headset, telling you to button up and get ready to move. Maybe you spotted movement in the distance. Maybe the radio crackled to life with new orders. Either way, you went from 0 to full alert in seconds. That shift from waiting to action was a shock every time. Your heart jumped, your stomach tightened, and you shoved whatever thoughts you'd been having into the back of your mind. The fear didn't disappear. It just got drowned out by the immediate job in front of you. And sometimes that job didn't end in a fight at all. Sometimes it was just moving to another spot to wait some more. But you always knew the waiting game could turn deadly without warning. Which is why, when it finally did turn deadly, it often happened faster than you could react, and faster than you could get out. The thing about being in a Sherman is that you always know the end can come quick. You tell yourself you'll see it coming, that you'll hear the shot, spot the glint of an enemy gun, or feel that gut instinct a second before it happens. But in reality, most of the time, you don't. One moment, you're alive, breathing stale air, hearing the hum of the engine, maybe thinking about the next turn in the road. The next moment, the world turns white and deafening, and you realise you've just been hit. A tank kill wasn't always a slow, cinematic thing like the movies like to show. Sometimes it was instant. A single hit in the wrong place, and everything inside went from functional to catastrophic in the space of a breath. A penetration could set off ammo, rupture fuel lines, or send fragments ricocheting inside at supersonic speeds. The noise inside was like someone had taken every sound you've ever feared and jammed it into one impossible instant. You didn't get time to think about it. The training said, bail out immediately if you're hit. But when the real thing happened, it wasn't orderly. It was instinct, panic, and muscle memory fighting each other while your body tried to process what just happened. If the tank caught fire, the smoke moved faster than you thought possible, clawing at your lungs and eyes. The heat was instant too, a wave that didn't give you time to hesitate. Sometimes the crew didn't even know exactly what had hit them. You might hear the sharp crack of an armour-piercing round or the heavier thump of a shaped charge, but identifying it didn't matter. What mattered was whether the tank was still moving. If it wasn't, you knew you had seconds to decide whether to stay or run. And in a Sherman in Italy, staying still after a hit was just asking for the second shot, the one that finished the job. Inside, the blast could turn the smallest object into shrapnel. Bolts snapped loose. Tools came off their racks. A pencil, a wrench, even a mess kit could turn into something sharp enough to kill you if it hit in the wrong place. Crewmen were thrown around like rag dolls, heads cracking against steel, arms and legs slamming into the narrow walls. And if the hit didn't kill you outright, it might trap you. A turret jammed at the wrong angle could block a hatch. The hull could warp and seize a door shut. You could be pinned under debris or wedged between the breach and the wall. Getting out in those moments wasn't just about speed. It was about luck and how the damage had twisted your world into a cage. The outside world didn't wait for you to sort yourself out. The enemy knew that if they'd hit you once, they could hit you again, and they wouldn't stop until the Sherman was a burning wreck. If you were lucky, other tanks in your unit would throw smoke, or lay down covering fire to give you a chance. If you weren't, you'd be scrambling over the side while shells landed close enough to rattle your teeth. There were stories, too many, of tanks going up so fast that no one got out. A single hit to the ammo rack could turn the whole interior into an explosion. In those cases, the tank didn't even burn for long. It just blew apart and left a blackened shell. The term brew up wasn't just slang. It was exactly what it looked like. A sudden, violent boil-over that consumed everything inside. And when you did make it out, you didn't have the luxury of standing around to process it. You hit the ground running, maybe with nothing but what you were wearing. Helmets, weapons, personal gear. All of it stayed in the tank if you didn't have time to grab it. Your only thought was to get far enough away before the next round found its mark. It was jarring how fast it happened. Hours of boredom, careful driving, scanning ridges, and thinking about rations could vanish in an instant, replaced by chaos, heat, and the kind of fear that leaves your hands shaking long after you've made it to cover. And yet, for every story of a crew lost in seconds, there was another about someone climbing back into a Sherman the next day. Because in war, you didn't always get the choice to walk away from the machine. And even if you did, the fight wasn't over, which leads to the strange truth that despite everything, the noise, the danger, the breakdowns, the fear, some men would still climb back into that steel box, knowing exactly what could happen. After everything, the cramped space, the heat, the cold, the bad food, the noise that rattled your teeth, the constant threat of being burned alive, you'd think no one in their right mind would ever want to climb back into a Sherman. And maybe want isn't the right word. But the truth is, most of the time, you didn't get a choice. The war didn't stop just because you were tired, scared, or fed up. If you were a tanker, the Sherman was your post, your tool, and your ride into whatever came next. Part of it was duty. That sounds like a neat, clean word for something that wasn't neat or clean at all. It meant doing your job because you were supposed to, because the guy next to you was counting on you, and because the alternative was letting someone else take your place in that target seat. Tank crews weren't interchangeable. Not really. Everyone had their role, and everyone knew how the others worked. Take one man out of that mix, and the whole machine, both steel and human, worked worse. Part of it was survival in the bigger sense. The Sherman might have been a thin-skinned target compared to a panther or a tiger, but it was still a hell of a lot safer than walking behind it with a rifle. If you weren't in the tank, you might be in the mud, in the open, with no armour at all. In a strange way, the Sherman was both your coffin and your shield, and trading it for a foxhole didn't always feel like an upgrade. Then there was momentum. War had its own kind of gravity. You didn't wake up and have a normal day. you woke up and stepped back into whatever job you'd been doing yesterday. If that job was gunning, loading, driving, or commanding a Sherman, you kept doing it until someone told you not to, or until the tank couldn't move anymore. And when a Sherman broke, got knocked out, or was abandoned, there was always another one waiting, another crew to join, another mission to roll out on. And you had your crew. That was maybe the biggest reason of all. The tank wasn't just a vehicle. It was the 5 men inside it. You lived with them, worked with them, ate with them, suffered with them. You knew their voices in the intercom, their habits in the turret, their moods in the quiet stretches between fights. Leaving the tank meant leaving them, and most guys couldn't do that unless they had no choice. Some even found a twisted comfort in the machine itself. You got to know your Sherman's quirks, the way the engine sounded when it was running right, the little hitch in the traverse gear that meant you had to nudge it past a certain point, the feel of the track tension when it was just right. For all its flaws, it was yours, and you learned to work with it. And maybe there was a piece of pride in it too, though most wouldn't say it out loud. Tankers knew they were part of something bigger, not in the grand patriotic sense, but in the very real fact that a functioning Sherman in the right place could turn a fight. You might be cramped, deafened, and half-starved, but you could put steel on target, protect the infantry, and push through places they couldn't. That counted for something, even if you didn't spend much time thinking about it in the moment. In the end, you climbed back in because that's where the war put you. You closed the hatch, settled into your seat, and went back to work. Not because it was safe, not because it was noble, but because someone had to, and it was your turn. And in the strange, ugly logic of war, that was reason enough. You didn't think about how it would end, not until it did. You thought about the next hill, the next village, the next stretch of road, where maybe, if luck held, you'd make it through without hearing that sharp, final crack of a gun that had you in its sights. And if you did hear it, you hoped you'd have the seconds you needed to get out. Until then, you stayed with the machine. Because for all its flaws, for all the ways it could kill you, it was still the thing that might get you home. And that's where we'll leave you for now. Still inside the steel box, engine humming, the smell of fuel and sweat thick in the air, eyes on a stretch of road that disappears into the hills. Maybe nothing will happen in the next few minutes. Maybe everything will. That's the way it always was. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. Drop a comment if you've got tank stories of your own, or if you just sat through this whole thing wondering why anyone would ever get inside one. And if you liked it, you know the drill. Thumbs up, subscribe, all that. If not, well, you're probably already asleep by now anyway. We'll pick this up another time. For now, you can keep the hatches open, or close them and see how long you can stand the quiet before you miss the noise. Either way, stay safe out there.